So in today's video, we're going to talk about classes, more specifically methods, and within methods, static and instance methods. Okay, so let's get started. Okay. So far what we've done is we've learned how to use a class. We know how to use class attributes. So what we'll do today is, let me just create a new class. You've seen this in a previous video. So I just say Java class and let's say person. Okay. We also know what this public stuff means. So now we can sort of get to doing what we want. When you want to create a class, like we spoke about in the last video, right? You normally create characteristics which are private. So this class that you are creating is no different from things like int or float or string. The only difference is int, float and string were created for you by the people who made Java, right? Whereas person is you now taking the role of the architect. So you are adding to the different types of things that Java can understand, right? So what you're doing here when you say class person is you are building a blueprint, right? So these are some of the best practices when you are building your own thing or your own type using your own blueprint, right? Every type of thing will have some sort of internal characteristics or internal state that may not be interesting to someone else, right? So actually, instead of saying person, let me not do that. Okay, let me create something called a rectangle. Okay, now every rectangle has a length, which in our case, let's say for now, we are using only integer values. You could also have rectangles which have decimal values, that's floats. But in our case, we're going to use int. So we say length, another int for width, right? Now, some of the best practices for creating your own data types is to make these guys private so that nobody apart from you, and you meaning the creator of the class, that means the architect, right? And what does that mean practically in terms of code? Basically everything within these walls, that is what's highlighted here, this opening curly bracket and closing curly bracket, only they will have access to things which are private, right? So if there's a method here, only this method will have access to these characteristics, right? So if nobody can access these things, there should be a way for you to set the values of these things, right? So using a constructor, which we've already learned about, we could say int length, int width, right? And you could say, now if you noticed in this header, that means in this function header, this function takes two parameters, right? Length and width. Now within this function, length and width, if you were to print them out, would refer to these arguments. But now there's something that's confusing, right? Your rectangle class also has a length and width. So how do you assign values to this length and width and not only this length and width, right? This length and width will get assigned when you call the constructor. But how do you give the values to these guys, which is part of this class, right? So the way to do that is Java has a keyword called this. So this means this object. So this dot length equals length and this dot width equals width, right? So what you're doing here is, this is a placeholder value, right? It means whatever the name of this object is later on, which you will see later on when we create the object, substitute that name here. So let me try to make this sort of concrete by giving you an example, right? when you want to create a value of a rectangle, you would say rectangle R1, let's say, equals, and obviously you know this from the previous video, new rectangle, and now you have to give it some values for width and height, right? So length and width, right? So I'm going to say length is 100 and width is 25, right? Now, how do you figure out what this is, right? So what has happened here when you created this new, when you've written this statement in Java, right? What actually happens in the computer is Java reads this whole statement, it goes to the right hand side of this equals to, and says that you want to create a new rectangle. So it therefore creates a new rectangle in memory for you. This rectangle R1 on the left hand side is a handle, or you can say a sort of a reference or a pointer to this object in memory, right? So if you notice what I said, R1 is a reference to this object in memory. So this is where the kind of, you can kind of make sense of what the this is. So when you say R1, right, and when you want to refer to, I want to get a sense of what this is, you could substitute R1 here, right? But of course, the creators of Java don't know the names of all the variables that you're going to give ahead of time. So this is R1. I could create another rectangle called R2. So this new rectangle 25, 10, right? Now, it's obviously not possible for the creators of Java to say that, oh, everybody, whenever you're creating your variables, this should be R1 or R2, right? So what they did was they came up with a keyword called this, and this is a shortcut or a alias for whichever object's variable name that you're using. So in the case of this object, this is R1. In the case of this object, this is R2, right? So this is a special THIS, this is a special keyword in Java, which means that, okay? So now that we've done this, right, one of the few things we would probably want is to get the values that we've already set, right, to just see if we want to, you know, print them out or do different things with them. If you're using an IDE, all you can do is right click, generate, and say I want a getter and setter, right? I'll explain what those mean. Select both of them and say okay, and the IDE will create some methods for you specifically for this class, right? You can also then get in here and modify things, right? So for example, length can never be negative, right? So we can come in here and say, and we can sort of modify it. So we can say if length is less than 0, then just return. That means don't do anything. Otherwise, set the length. And similarly to width, we could do the same thing to width also. If width is less than 0, then just return from this function, right? Now this width is referring to the width here, right? And this dot width is referring to the width here. So I hope that's clear now. I mean, it could be confusing when you sort of first get into kind of object-oriented programming. So I hope this kind of clears it up. Okay. So now that we've got these, I'm sort of using specific terms to describe each of these things, right? So for example, I said these are methods in Java, right? Another thing that you could do is, instead of having a constructor, you could create what is known as a static method. So you can say static new rect and int width, int, just to make it simple, int width, right? Now this rectangle, this function is what is known as a static function, right? So here, what is a static function? A static function is a function where the value of this thing, this dot, doesn't exist, right? A static function is really just, I mean, it's, to put it very simply, a static function is just a namespaced function, which means where is it namespaced? So to find that out, all you need to do is you need to look at the class that encloses this static function. So this class that encloses it is rectangle. So this function is namespaced within a rectangle. Now, in the case of this function named newRect, I mean, it may not be that any other class might have a function called newRect. So what we could do is actually, what we could change is we could say new, right? So in this case, what's happening here is, so I'm going to say new instance, right? In this case, what we're going to, what you can see here is, there could be other classes, like instead of rectangle, there could have been another class called square, which also has a function called new instance. So when you want to call the functions, how would that work? So first, let's actually let's flesh this out. So this function, looking at the header, okay, is a static function, which means it's namespaced. We'll get to what that means when we call it. This function takes a length and a width and returns a new object of a rectangle, right? So simple, just say return new rectangle length, comma, width. Okay, now when you want to call this function, earlier, when we've seen it in the previous video, if I wanted to call a function on this object, which is R1, which is a reference to this object which is created in memory, right? All I did was I would say R1, so let's try and print out something, R1 dot get width equals plus R1 dot get width, right? So if you noticed, I had to use this particular syntax, which is called message passing, right? Which is, I give R1 is a reference to this object in memory, dot is a kind of way of saying send to, and get width is the name of the method, right? But if I have a static function like this guy, right, how do I call this static function? So the way to call the static function is two ways, okay? One is, now what is the static function going to return? It's going to return a new instance of a rectangle object, right? So I'm going to say rectangle R2 rectangle dot new instance, and I'm going to say 50, 20, right? Now this is the way to call this static method, right? You give it the class name and you give it the static method to call, and then everything else is the same. You use the same parameters and everything else remains the same, right? This will do the same thing as this, similar to this, right? But there's a different way of calling it. So I could say sout r2 dot get length equals r2 dot get length. Now let's run all this code and see that we get what the values that we really wanted, right? So what's the reason for having a static function rather than a method? In a static function, you don't have to create a new object in memory before you can use it. You just run the function by stating the class name, dot, and the name of the method. So this is really useful. And when I show you how to read the Java documentation later, you'll see a class called math, right? So math dot, let's say square root, right? Of let's say 100, right? So I could print this out. And run this, and you should see 10.0, right? So if you notice, for the math class, there is this function called square root, which really doesn't belong to any object. You don't need to create an object to run this function. So this is like a sort of a, it's a little bit more pragmatic, right? You don't need to create the object by saying new math and stuff like that, because it doesn't make any sense, right? So that is what's the difference between static functions and normal methods, right? So now that you've taken over the role of this architect type of person, right? Let's try and augment or add to this rectangle class and try and make it a little bit better, right? So let's add a method which returns the area of a rectangle, right? So this, the formula is length into breadth. So I would say this dot length into this dot breadth or width, right? And this would give me the area of the function. Now, I have very specifically said this dot and this dot, right? Just to make sure that you understand, when I say length, I'm referring to this variable. And when I say width, I'm referring to this variable, right? But if you notice in this function signature, so actually let me run this first and then I'll come back to that, okay? So S out, let me go back here. And let me say I want to get the area of this. So area of R2 equals plus R2 dot area, and run this code, right? And you can see the area of R2, right? Because it's 50 into 20. Now, I was being explicit here when I said this dot and this dot, but to be very fair, in this function, if you notice, this function header doesn't have the same values in its arguments that these two functions have, right? So here I could have actually left out this. And how will this work, right? So when Java sees this code, Java will look at this value length and know it's a variable name, and it will look in the function header or anywhere else in the function. Is this length defined anywhere else? No, right? There is no other value for length. Is width defined anywhere else? No. So it will go to length and take the value of length which is in the class. It will do the same thing for width. So here, if I run this code, you'll actually see the same answer. You won't get an error, right? Even though I've not put this, okay? So this was just a basic introduction to class methods, which are these guys, class static methods, which are these guys, and an explanation for what this pointer is, right? So this pointer, by the way, will keep changing, right? So this pointer refers to R1 when you're in the context of R1 here, and it will change to R2 when you're in the context of R2, right? So when you write your code, all you have to think about is, you don't have to bother about whether this variable is going to be called R1, R2, R3, R10 later on. All you need to know is that the right thing will happen if you use this keyword this, okay? So this was just a short video on using methods and static methods in Java, and just explaining what this pointer or this reference is actually doing in Java, okay? So I think this should be fairly clear. If not, maybe just, message in the comments any doubts or anything like that, and we'll try and get back to you. Thank you.